What a pleasure to be here today. What an amazing institution. I just had a chance to go through the technology showcase. It's just extraordinary to see all the ideas there. I'm an academic at UC San Diego and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where, thank you for a cheer, a couple of us here. Next year, there'll be more. One of the things I do is I work on decarbonization of electric power grids, natural gas systems, transportation systems like aviation and vehicles. And as part of that research, what we do is we look at the relationship between technological change and political change. And that's what I'd really like to talk about today. As the activities that are represented in this room are successful, they're going to change the politics. They're going to create new companies that are going to create new jobs. And by doing that, they're going to create new interest groups that are going to want more of that. And that process is going to extend on into the future. And so that process should give us actually quite a lot of hope about long-term solutions for the climate change crisis. And I think will help us think about our role as people who study technology in altering the underlying political landscape in this country and indeed all around the world. What I see as somebody who studies these systems is a change across the political spectrum here in the United States, not just on the left, but also on the right, as more people see political opportunities, job opportunities, new industries being created, the kinds of enormous opportunities that Arun Majumdar spoke about earlier when he was today. And as that happens, we're going to see the politics shift inside the country. And it's that theory of change that I'd like to talk about today, because I think it alters a little bit, maybe a lot, how we think about what it is that we're trying to do, the role of ARPA-E, and indeed the role of the other activities at the Department of Energy in addressing the climate change problem. One of the things that makes it, I think, very clear is that as the politics shift, as you see more vested interests, in a good way, vested interests that want cleaner energy futures, that want to create more companies like the companies that people in this room are trying to create, as that happens, we're going to shift the current. And the politics of the climate change problem, which used to be, frankly, very, very hard, swimming against a strong current, the politics become a little bit easier, and over time become even easier as we shift and redirect the current, and as we swim with that current, and it takes off. At the center of this new theory of change, of this thinking about the relationship between technology and politics, is uncertainty. And I think we have to recognize that for too long, people who study and are active on the climate change problem have viewed uncertainty as the enemy. They have thought that if the public doesn't have confidence that all the scientific facts are in, they won't be willing to act. They have thought that if we don't have all the technologies available on the shelf, this proverbial shelf, it must be a very heavy shelf with all those technologies sitting on it, if they're not sitting there on that shelf, ready to go, that we are not going to make progress on the climate change problem. Uncertainty has been thought of as the enemy in that process. That view of uncertainty, I think, is completely wrong. We have a long history in this country and lots of other countries of acting on environmental problems before all the facts were in. Look at the ozone layer accords, the most successful international environmental agreements of all time. The key pieces of those arrangements were put into place before we ran the converted U-2 spy plane flights into the ozone hole to figure out who was responsible for the ozone hole. Look at the history of acid rain, where almost all the key pieces of legislation and action and investment were in place before the facts were in, before we frankly had connected all the dots together. And the list goes on and on and on. But I think the role of uncertainty in this room is even more important, because technological change, innovation, transformation in new industries is intrinsically an uncertain process. We all can imagine potentials for new kinds of electric grids or hydrogen systems, the elements of what we think of as the clean energy economy. We can all kind of imagine the pieces and how they would fit together. But frankly, we don't really know. We don't know which ideas are going to be successful and not successful. And that just is not a recipe for paralysis for the people in this room. It's not a recipe for paralysis in climate policy action. What I'm seeing, not only in this country, but around the world, is a growing number of firms and governments that are highly committed to doing something serious about the climate change problem. But they don't know what to do. They're committed, they're acting, they're investing, they're testing new ideas, but they don't know exactly what's going to work. They don't know where and how to scale up new technologies. In some industries, the so-called hard-to-abate industries, frankly, we often don't have a clue. We don't know what the right strategies are going forward. But nonetheless, firms and governments are motivated to make big changes. And I think that is a way to think about what it is that we're doing inside this room. All kinds of different ideas where, in effect, what we're doing is we're investing in new technologies and we're learning about what's possible, what's not possible, and then identifying the solutions that might scale and moving from there. My own group does a lot of work with the Electric Power Research Institute and with firms in the electric power industry, and you see this transformation inside that industry, the industry that has so far made the largest contributions to reducing emissions in the United States. And yet, when you look at the potential for not shallow decarbonization, but deep decarbonization in that industry, it's the unknowns that are more compelling, I think, frankly, than the knowns. For example, electric vehicles. I live in California. We have a huge potential for electrifying transportation, and we're well on our way in doing that. For us, because the sun is always shining in California, at least when we're not under feet of water, the key thing is to get people to move from charging their vehicles at night to charging their vehicles during the day. We can imagine lots of technological solutions to that problem. We can imagine lots of new businesses that could emerge, workplace charging and so on. One of the key uncertainties there is actually not technological, it's human behavior. What incentives, what information, what new business models are going to get people to shift from charging their electric vehicles at night to the daytime? And that's one example of many that are all familiar to you in this room. Areas where we can imagine futures, but without testing new ideas, we're not really going to know what works and what doesn't work. A few months ago, Chuck Sable at Columbia Law School and I published a book called Fixing the Climate, and it lays out how societies solve these problems when there's a strong motivation to act and nobody really knows what to do. And our answer is experimentalism. It's that you create strong incentives to go off and test new ideas, new technologies, new business models, learn about them in context, figure out what works and what doesn't work. And the reason I was so excited to come here and talk at ARPA-E is because what I see ARPA-E doing, its success story from the very beginning, as Arun laid out earlier today, has been as an experimentalist institution. It's been an institution that has worked with you to go explore the tails of the distributions. Lots of ideas, some crazy, now seem mainstream. Others mainstream, later crazy. Walk through the technology showcase. It's unbelievable, all the different ideas. And what ARPA-E is doing is helping you, everyone, run those kinds of experiments. And then crucially, it's helping learn. It's helping us as a society learn which of those experiments work, which of those experiments don't work, and then scaling up the ones that work, and then learning how to accelerate the scaling process, not just through ARPA-E, but through the Loan Program Office and a variety of other activities at DOE and in other parts of the government. I think that's good news. I think it's really, really profoundly important news, not only for technology, but for politics and for the reinforcement between technology and politics. And I'd like to suggest that's really what we're doing here. And as I wrap up, I want to just talk about a few areas where we need to be realistic. We need to have a very clear idea of what we're doing and how quickly we can do it. First is the idea of goals. Everyone's talking about stopping global warming at 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. I do not think those goals are achievable anymore because we've waited too long. That's not a sign of defeat. That's a sign that this is a really, really hard problem to address. And we need to think differently about the metrics of progress. Let me give you an example. 15 years ago, the world was on track for 4 or 5 degrees of warming. The impacts of 4 or 5 degrees of warming were so severe, likely to be so severe, we didn't really know how to estimate them. Today, we're on track for maybe 2.5, 2.8 degrees of warming with more effort, maybe a little bit better. That's not 5, that's not 4. Those are the real kinds of signs of progress. And I think we're going to see this in every industry as we start to get really serious about deep decarbonization. A lot of people are talking about banning internal combustion engines by the year 2030, 35. Maybe that'll happen, maybe that won't happen. If we adjust those targets, we have one in California, many other states have similar targets. If we adjust those targets and relax those targets, it won't be for lack of serious effort. And that should not be viewed as a sign of failure. It should be viewed as a sign of learning. Any target, aggressive target that is set in the context of deep unknowns, of essentially unknowable things, has to be corrigible. It has to be adjustable in light of experience. And indeed, that's been California's experience with air pollution regulation. Our famous zero-emission vehicle rule in the 1990s was adjusted many, many times, tweaked this way and that way, sometimes ratcheted tighter, sometimes loosened up, because the regulators found ways to work with industry and with innovators to adjust the goals in light of what was possible, and I think that's going to be one of our most important roles here. Second, very briefly, I want to just underscore that the kind of innovation that's happening here is not innovation that would happen automatically. It's not manna from heaven that's just raining down over the world, creating the energy transformation. It's happening in part because government's spending money, and it's happening in part because many firms are terrified that if they don't get serious about the climate change problem, that they will lose their license to operate. Look no further than the European oil and gas firms that were among the very first, in the oil and gas industry at least, to take the climate change problem seriously. You may like oil and gas firms, you may not like oil and gas firms, but my point is that they saw the motivation in their electorates to do something different, and they're now spending money, significant amounts of money, to adjust and learn. They're also losing a lot of money along the way. Some of those companies will disappear, some of those companies may thrive, and we just don't know. Why should you care about this? You should care about this because these are your partners, at least in part your partners, are the firms that are highly motivated to do something about the climate change problem. And so we as entrepreneurs should be looking not only at our technologies, but also the kinds of firms that are motivated to pick them up and carry them into practice. And the third and last thing I want to talk about is trade. It may seem really weird on a stage where everyone's talking about innovation and politics to some degree to be talking about international trade policy. You care a lot about trade, and there are some very worrisome trends that are underway right now. There's this terrific book by Greg Nemeth called How Solar Got Cheap. And it tells a story about how the technological frontier for solar began in the United States and Japan, moved to Germany with the Energiewende, then moved to Japan with the huge manufacturing revolution that really drove down costs. It was a learning curve on a global scale. That's why solar is cheap today, is because the best firms could sell product globally and run down a global learning curve as fast as possible. That story is being replicated in batteries. We're on the cusp of replicating that story in many other kinds of technologies as well. And we have an interest in keeping enough trade doors open, a global enough trading system that we can do the same thing for the kinds of technologies that all of you invent. Why do I mention this? Because I think one of the dark sides of American politics right now is you do not have the votes on the Hill to be able to do things like the Inflation Reduction Act or the CHIPS Act unless there's a big American flag put on top of those supply chains. And some of that is necessary for the politics, but we have to be careful. We have to be careful that we don't create supply chains that are all fragmented and balkanized, and we don't undercut the tremendous advantage that comes from job creation and innovation here that can then sell product globally and come down global supply chains and global learning curves. Let me just end by saying that in some sense, the theory of change that I'm talking about here, the theory of change that all of you are in the middle of, is not just a theory of change about technology, it's a theory of change about politics. And it's in some sense, it's the opposite of Vegas rules. The goal here is for what happens at ARPA-E not to stay at ARPA-E. It's for what happens at ARPA-E to create new technologies, new businesses, new wealth, and new politics, not just in this country, but in all the rest of the world where most of the emissions are happening, in addition to our own efforts at controlling those emissions here, such that as we start to come down the learning curves of these new technologies, we transform the global industry. In doing that, we transform the politics, and we take the climate problem, which for a long time has been an understandably daunting problem, and make it a whole lot easier, both politically and technologically. Thank you very much.